Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program, Painting the Inhabited Landscape, Fitz H. Lane and the Global Reach of Antebellum America, with Margaretta Lovell. The Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources AAS has been collecting since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world to use the collections in our research library, both physical and digital collections, we host programs like tonight's that provide insights into the past and also its resonance for our own day. We thank you for joining us this evening. And as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. My colleague, John Garcia, will be sharing a few notes on how to comment and ask questions in the Zoom Q&A. And I would encourage you, as questions occur to you, to go ahead and put your questions into that Q&A for later on in the program. John will also post links and relevant information in the chat throughout the program. This program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube page following the live stream. And now I'm happy to introduce Margaretta Lovell, a longtime friend of the American Antiquarian Society and an extraordinary scholar and teacher I've known for more than 30 years. Margaretta holds the J.D. McAvoy Jr. Chair in the History of American Art at the University of California, Berkeley. But that title barely scratches the surface of her scholarship. Margaretta Lovell is fundamentally a cultural historian who works at the intersection of history, art and architectural history, and anthropology. Throughout her career, she has challenged the ways we look at American painting by placing works firmly and deeply in their social, economic, and cultural contexts, and by considering the many people involved in making a work of art and the communities in which people created and consumed art. Her scholarship is wide-ranging, from 18th century family portraits to contemporary photography, and it is invariably of the highest quality. Her book, Art in a Season of Revolution, Painters, Artisans, and Patrons in Early America, won the Eldridge Prize from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Her book, A Visitable Past, Views of Venice by American Artists, 1860 to 1915, won the Ralph Henry Gabriel Prize of the American Studies Association. She has also curated major international exhibitions on American and British art, and she's won teaching awards from the College Art Association and from Berkeley. The list of Margaretta Lovell's fellowships and grants is exhaustive and impressive: Guggenheim, NEH, and many more, but I want to focus on just one. In 2007-2008, Margaretta spent the academic year here at the American Antiquarian Society as our Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence, our fellowship for an eminent senior scholar who serves also as the leader of our scholarly community for that year. Beyond this, Margaretta served on AAS's governing board, our council, for 6 years, for which my colleagues and I are forever grateful. Margaretta spent her year here working on her new book, so it's a special joy to welcome her back tonight to talk about it. The book is Painting the Inhabited Landscape, Fitz H. Lane and the Global Reach of Antebellum America, and it is a pleasure to turn this program over to Margaretta Lovell.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you about, virtually, about Fitz Henry Lane. What I'd like to do is to talk to you a little bit about one section of the book. It was recently published in April by Penn State Press. The book focuses on the 20-year history of Lane's career as a fine artist in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. And during that time, he traveled from his native Gloucester in Massachusetts to Maine at least 6 times. And so I'm going to focus today on those trips to coastal Maine. My sources for laying out a new interpretation of the work of this artist include an analysis of period maps and his drawings, diaries, letters, the paintings themselves, but most memorably, Gloucester's newspapers, which together with some really interesting diaries I read during that wonderful year under the dome at AAS. So what I've tried to do in this project is to see the world as Lane and his contemporaries saw it. I've tried to inhabit their experience. So I'm looking not only at such documents as the newspapers, but also at his paintings with great care, particularly at what some art historians have called the incidental detail within his works. So the chapter I'm going to talk about today is called Lumber. There are other chapters called Canvas and Granite and Fish. All of those focus on Gloucester, Massachusetts. But then there are other chapters devoted to New England's links to Suriname, California, Puerto Rico, and China. So let me share my screen. Yikes, why am I not getting a screen share? Oh, yes, there we go. So Lumber, as I said, is a chapter about Maine, and the Maine that Lane knew from his cruising with friends in a sloop and camping out in the Penobscot Bay, and the weeks that he spent in the town of Castine, visiting the friends of the family of his friend, Joseph Stevens. And I've indicated those spots roughly on this 1836 map. Castine, Owl's Head in the lower left, and Mount Desert. These are the three important points of his main views. The scenery that was sought out by other artists who were painting Maine at this time was wild nature. This is Frederick Church's view from Cadillac Mountain on Mount Desert Island. This is, as is the case with so many artists, a view from an eminence. And this is an oil sketch, a really beautiful work. It's the Maine that is pictured as though the viewer were the first person to see this slice of pure nature. Church was by far the more celebrated artist, and he painted the Maine that his New York patrons wanted to see and to buy. Church's Maine is a virtually untouched landscape. That is to say, it's a very powerful fiction in selling of images, and also in pressing the extremely powerful and rapacious doctrine of manifest destiny, the myth of an empty continent, which it is understood to be a virgin land, voided by retreating or assimilating or deceasing Native Americans. Lane is very different. On the other hand, he turned his attention to townscapes and harbors and to the activities in Maine that revolved around lumber. And this is why I called the book Painting the Inhabited Landscape, to underline the difference between the usual reading of Maine in this period and Lane's. This is Entrance to Some Sound from Southwest Harbor, a stunningly beautiful painting in which the hold of a brig is being loaded with dimensioned lumber, cut in the distant forests and milled on one of Mount Desert's 6 busy lumber mills. More planks will be loaded onto the deck for the voyage to distant markets. Lane portrayed focused vignettes of specific kinds of labor, such as the loading of wood here, rather than attempting to portray the vast scale of Maine's lumber extraction industry. Wood was big business. In 1850, when Lane and other artists were making trips there in the summertime, the lumbering industry, just in the Penobscot watershed, employed 10,000 men. In 1866, the yearly timber crop of the state was worth almost $20 million. So this was very big business. According to one observer, by the middle of the 19th century, and I quote, immense tracts of land all along the coast of Maine, from the St. Croix to the Penobscot River, were clear-cut and thus presented what he called a desolate and forbidding aspect. But most painters steadfastly averted their eyes, not only from extraction industries, but also from commerce of all kinds. Just as entrance to some sound from the Southwest Harbor evokes an activity that was omnipresent, here in another Lane painting, a single outbound topsail schooner loaded high with boards in a beautiful painting, Lumber Schooners at Evening on Penobscot Bay of 1863, stands for hundreds of coasters moving south with this valuable cargo throughout the spring, summer, and fall months. These vignettes of the lumber industry are offered as singular examples, meticulously articulated portraits of everyday, ordinary activities, characteristic of that place, that time, and often set here in a poetic framework with a transitional time of day. These pictures are about a working landscape, brigs and schooners, and the workers and mariners who loaded and managed them, and about the larger economies and connections with which these activities participated. While describing particular activities and cargoes, they also reference cutting of thousands of trees deep in Lane's remote forests, vast log drives, thundering sawmills, treacherous journeys through tempestuous seas, and eventual purchase and consumption in the production of houses and barns, wharfs and ships, barrels and buckets in cities near and far. The protagonist in this image is a vernacular vessel, cunningly constructed and managed to produce motion, to enact human will. It's a technologically complex fabrication of wood, rope, canvas, and metal fittings, designed to harness the wind to move a heavy cargo through the resistant medium of water towards some far distant place. This topsail schooner and its cargo, so lyrically poised against an ombre sky, are part of a vast national, even international market for this, the primary building material in North America. The seemingly quiet scene portrays one moment in the career of one of hundreds of coasters that carried this profitable crop south to Gloucester and Boston, Charleston, the West Indies, and even as far as Australia. Each coaster averaging 3 to 17 round trips a year. Most commentary on these images is about geometry, and I quote other scholars. Formal patterns and contrasts, dark against light, diagonals against horizon line. They see in this image, and I quote, an image purified by the suppression of extraneous detail. But I'm encouraging you to look at the details in Lane's paintings, to understand them as anything but extraneous. While they appear to depict quotidian moments of no particular consequence, their details do point towards an international as well as a local series of concerns, and to the integration of humans into both their environment and the global economy. The key implied ingredients in this painting, I argue, are valuable extractable resources, human labor and ingenuity, and linkage to larger communities and economies. From the shaggy forests of Maine to the finished houses, ships, barns of the eastern seaboard, human activity and its material culture constituted a single system in which ships, people, logs, lumber, and money moved in continuous productive cycles. The most prized New England tree was the white pine, flourishing especially near riverbanks within old-growth forests on the cusp between the spruce fir forest in northern Maine and the beech birch maple hemlock forest in southern New England, and reaching 200 feet or more with a straight, smooth trunk. The white pine yielded a wood that was lighter, softer, freer of knots, and more durable, and with a greater proportion of heartwood than any other. And since it was easier to work than other woods, it involved lower labor costs. It was particularly prized for ship masts, and thus was embroiled in political and military, as well as economic and artisanal narratives from the 16th century on. The boards, and to a lesser extent, the timbers, posts, palings, lath, barrel staves, mast trees, compass timbers, and cordwood, were transported in beamy brigs and schooners by sea, often on perilous journeys, to towns where such lumber was scarce, or to sites where sawmills had not yet been established, such as mid-century California. Implicit in Lane's paintings are the artisanal acts and know-how that used this lumber to construct the houses and barns, bridges in antebellum America. one feels in his paintings a sense of respect, not only for the designers of ships and riggers of spars, but also for the loaders of wood, the builders of homes, and the mariners who made this economy work. Castine was Lane's home base in Maine. He spent weeks here during many summers at the home of the town's physician, Dr. Joseph Stevens, just uphill from the harbor. There were substantial historic links between Cape Ann in Massachusetts and coastal Maine, a Gloucester, Maine backstory of migration and remigration involving the Stevens family and Lane's own family, among many others. It's a narrative of dislocation, loss, and aggression, as well as adventure, success, and apparent harmony. According to one art historian, Lane saw Maine, and I quote, as a more purified and untroubled place, conducive to resting and uplift the spirit. But such a perspective is, as I say, seen by others in this painting, Castine Harbor and Town of 1851. But in that sense, this painting exemplifies the view of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who spoke of the young United States as, and I quote, a country where there is no shadow, no antiquity, no mystery, no picturesque or gloomy wrong, nor anything but a commonplace prosperity in broad and simple daylight. In this painting, the brig on the left catches the late afternoon light, and the day trippers in the little gaff-rigged schooner in the foreground appear to represent an untroubled place of commonplace prosperity, seen in the clear descriptive light of early evening. But Lane's paintings of the town of Castine and Penobscot Bay, I argue, in fact, insist on intimations of Hawthornian shadow, antiquity, and gloomy wrong. Pictured from the perspective of a ruined revolutionary fort on the hill above the town, Castine appears to be a well-ordered community of white clapboarded homes, churches, a rope walk, and schools clustered near the Deepwater Harbor, which was the settlement's most important asset. A scene of haying occupies the sunny middle distance, but this is not just picturesque pastoral summer farm work. It's a crucial aspect of the logging industry. There was little meadowland for haying in 19th century Maine, and yet the oxen that provided the muscle of the logging industry could not survive their winter work without hay. It took as many as 14 oxen to draw a single log from the place where it grew to the nearest riverbank. Hay to feed the oxen was valuable. Without the hay, oxen would starve. Without oxen, the logs could not move. The making of hay, then, in Lane's painting, signals the linkage of meadow to forest, the making of profit. Here as elsewhere, Lane has underlined relationships between land, labor, and broader economic communities. Against the darker green grass sprinkled with wildflowers in the foreground, a transaction is taking place. A bonneted Euro-American woman, parasol in hand, pauses in her walk to look at baskets proffered by two darkly clad Native American women in the matter-of-fact hybrid clothing of those living in physical and cultural proximity to Euro-American 19th century settlements. Sturdy baskets made of brown ash splints, a forest product fabricated from beaten ash logs, had long been crafted by the indigenous people of Maine, and they were sought after, prized, and used in the majority culture as indispensable sturdy carryalls. What did Lane intend to suggest with the inclusion of these figures and these baskets in his painting? Perhaps he sought to describe the everyday character of contact with Native people in Castine, or the persistence of their very useful arts and crafts, or perhaps the deep history of not always so benign cultural contact in coastal Maine. We know that his hosts, the Stevenses, visited nearby Wabanaki seasonal camps, and that a group of Penobscots were in Gloucester when that town went up in flames in 1830, and were credited with extinguishing that conflagration. They also frequented downtown Bangor in what one resident termed light and airy attire of blankets and paint. We also know that they owned and profited from renting valuable frontage above Bangor to the operators of the Penobscot River boom, where annually thousands of logs were caught, sorted, rafted, and held until sold to mill operators. In the background, Lane and those in his community read weekly in the Gloucester newspapers about Indian removal, about conflict between settlers and native populations in the West, and about policy debates concerning native tribes, treaties, and futures. These news reports would have inevitably brought to mind similar events distant in time from the artist's sojourns in Castine, but close in geography. Lane's host, Dr. Stevens, was an antiquarian, deeply informed about the history of Massachusetts and the settlement of that state in Maine. On this early 18th century map of Casco Bay, you'll notice a fort and blockhouse, indications of hostilities between native and English populations. James Lane, the family's progenitor, in 1660 moved to Casco, Maine, a landscape of farms and forts. In 1866, James, together with other settlers, was killed by Wabanakis. Two of his sons survived and retreated to Gloucester. John Lane, in the next generation, was a mariner, and during a fishing trip in the summer of 1724, he put into Owl's Head to make repairs, where he was killed by Native Americans. John's grandson, William Lane, was also killed by Native Americans at Owl's Head on an unspecified date before 1760. These were not isolated incidents, nor were they simply the acts on the part of an indigenous population resisting intrusion. These local conflicts were localized chapters in larger European wars and religious hostilities. Altogether, 6 of Lane's antecedents were killed by Native Americans between 1688 and 1760. Some at Falmouth, now Portsmouth, Portland, but most near the mouth of Penobscot Bay, where the artist summered and painted and sojourned in the household, steeped in history. For that Lane, then, the landscape of Maine was not, I would say, the untroubled place that 20th century visitors to Maine experienced and valued, but a landscape in which grim historic events had happened that directly impacted both the ancestors of the basket makers and his own family's 5-generational life retreat to Massachusetts. The dramatic landmark, Owl's Head, a distinctive pair of steep hills on a prominent point at the mouth of Penobscot Bay, where the majestic estuary meets the Atlantic, had a private and ominous character for Lane as a site of the murder of kinsmen, as well as a more public character as a prominent marine landmark. Lane painted Owl's Head repeatedly. This is his best known view of the site, showing the pair of hills and lighthouse in the pearly light of early morning. These Lane's flatwater views have usually been interpreted by scholars as more contemplative and intellectual and deeper than his choppy water paintings that were favored by his contemporaries. Lane invites introspection here by including a prominent turned figure in the foreground. This man is not rowing or cleaning fish or taking in sail or loading lumber. He's looking, and he's looking at Owl's Head, inviting the painter's viewer to look and think as well. The sight of Lane's kinsmen's unforeseen deaths and the larger historic scene of deadly antagonism throughout centuries of Maine's history, it is a worthy object of contemplation. Equally masterful is Lane's Ships in an Approaching Storm off Owl's Head of 1860, in which that landmark is a ghostly dark rise looming between ominous cloud masses and the inky black sea, even more beautifully painted than the chromatic, subtle skies for which Lane is so celebrated. This monochrome blanket of dark air with a sliver of light blue water at the horizon interrupted by the dark mass of Owl's Head between the vessels has astonishing depth and weight, at once fearsome and sublime. 7 sailors scramble in the rigging of the 3-master in the middle of the painting and on the sloop at the left to furl sails and secure canvas as the blackening sky and dangerous winds close in. Few other subjects receive such sustained attention from Lane as Owl's Head. He pictured the distinctive promontory from the north and the south, during night and during daytime, in gusty conditions and dead calm, as well as here, shrouded in tempestuous darkness. As a trope for memory and history, death and disaster, this double-humped promontory does well, inviting the viewer to see time, that is, the events it has witnessed, as well as geography of place. While the bounty of Maine's forests passed this landmark outbound as lumber and fur to service the needs and desires of a global market, the quarrels and wars of European monarchs were transported inbound to Royal Maine's coastal inhabitants, leaving an aura of Hawthornian shadow and gloomy wrong in the air more than a century after the antecedents of Lane's basket makers faced the antecedents of his basket buyers with mutual suspicion, animosity, and sometimes murderous intent. Castine, seemingly so modest in scale and quiet in outlook to modern eyes, was also the scene of major conflict and violence among Europeans. This object of long-term global geopolitical rivalries and military action, because of its deep-water natural harbor near the mouth of the Penobscot River, its concentration of major importers and dealers in salt, and especially its proximity to the major lumber resources, especially those white pines that were so coveted for masts by all the major European naval powers, and rich offshore fishing grounds, as well as a beaver-rich interior. Lane painted a second view of Castine, you see here, from the ruins of a revolutionary fort that, instead of basket sellers, includes a cannon as an unmistakable relic of turbulent historic times, characterized by aggression and hostility. The cannon, in Lane's day, a defanged inert object of curiosity, was a serious instrument of death and destruction in its career as a weapon in this highly militarized small town. Castine's harbor was the site of 5 naval engagements, and the town itself was besieged, occupied, razed, and fortified many times. A zone of shifting sovereignty that saw in quick succession conquest and reconquest by 4 nations keen to control and exploit its highly sought-after resources. Castine's prosperity began in the mid-16th century, as did its identity as a prize fought over by French, English, Dutch, and eventually American forces. The cannon included in this, Lane's view of Castine from Point George, is not, I argue, incidental detail, but a pointed reference not only to the ramparts of the Revolutionary era fort on which the artist sat to make his preparatory works for this painting, but a reference to the whole complex international history of violence and contested possession, literally underfoot. It's been said that Lane's canvases depict a conflict between civilization and wilderness, but I would say there's little evidence that Lane was interested in anything as grand as civilization or as wild as wilderness. His paintings evidence an artist interested in how humans used resources, built community, and retained memory of the past. His paintings are neither grand celebrations nor national elegies. Their narratives are most often of small events that he, his friends, and his patrons recognized as representing quotidian occurrences: the loading of boards, the reefing of sails, the cutting of hay, all resonant of deep human history and complex social and economic webs. So I'm going to stop there and turn the floor back over to Scott.
Margaretta, that's wonderful. And the book is marvelous. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I encourage folks to buy it and read it and enjoy looking at it as well as reading it. It's absolutely gorgeously done. This is a good example of art scholarship at its finest production in every single way. The way you ended that talk, which is about contrasting the way Lane has been interpreted by many scholars with your interpretation, put in mind a sentence that's on page 131 of your book, and I love this sentence: "But sometimes a wrecked schooner is just a wrecked schooner."
So you caught that. Yes, I guess I'm a literalist is what it comes down to. I am arguing against the myth and symbols school, as it was known, of American studies on the one hand, and what you might call the proto-abstract expressionist school that says, don't look at what's going on in these paintings, just look at the diagonals and the geometry, that tried to make these into abstract paintings. So yes, I am arguing in 2 different directions there.
Well, and when I was in graduate school studying American painting, Lane was typically categorized through the term luminism. It was all about the light in the paintings. It was never about what was actually happening inside those paintings. Now I'm wondering which of Lane's paintings I was actually looking at to make those interpretations. Was it a certain slice of his paintings that did not include some of these Gloucester and Owl's Head ones with so much action that once I read your book, it's impossible to miss all that action? Why are we missing it?
Well, it was there because I've shown some of the paintings that were most frequently exhibited in exhibitions and selected for histories of American art. They just weren't looking at what I find interesting. So those Owl's Head views, for instance, were very much on the covers of books and in publications of all kinds.
Yeah, and in one chapter of the book, you describe the history of Lane's own reputation, the fact that not long after his own death, he became almost neglected especially by folks outside his own community. And it's only in the mid-20th century that we see the resurrection of his work. And we see the resurrection of his work in this way, through this interpretation about light and geometry and all the rest. I mean, what accounts for what you might call the fall and rise of Lane?
Yes, you're making this rather Miltonian, aren't you?
Maybe.
As one reason that I decided to work on Lane is that he's such an interesting case in canon formation. He had a modest reputation during his lifetime. He sold paintings locally. He sold a few at a distance through exhibitions, but generally he had a local reputation. But as soon as he died, his paintings fell into oblivion. Right? They got moved to barns and attics. And I went carefully through all of the auction records I could possibly find. This is one of the great reasons why I enjoyed working not only at AAS, but also at the Huntington, is you can do this kind of thing. Not a single Lane painting changed hands at auction for 70 years, which is sort of astonishing. They passed down in the same families, as I say, sitting there in the barn or in the attic, and in some cases on the walls and back parlors and things like that. So I found the business about the canon formation question. Why was he so completely out of the canon that even the first generation of people doing histories of American art don't mention him? They mention some people that we nowadays think are, should be in oblivion. But they don't mention Lane at all. He's not even on the map. But then during the middle of the 20th century, he begins his paintings, which I would say are rather magical, begin to appeal to people, and they try to figure out a way to describe them that will make them part of a national history of art production that's somehow independent of Europe. But also this, and I find it really very period specific, very Cold War specific, is that they try very hard to make his paintings abstract. And they use the same language that is being used to describe the generation of American artists who were important at that moment, the abstract expressionists, who were being credited as the first invention on the part of Americans to contribute to Western, the Western art canon. So those were the big boys on the horizon. So there was an attempt to sort of, bring some American painters into that fold by thinking of them as predecessors 100 years earlier. And so his reputation soared. I think, in other words, I'm not saying that it was a bad thing that was done, but that it was extremely effective in terms of bringing those paintings out of the attics and barns and into the market. And there were wonderful exhibitions done of his work, and interesting books and some scholarship done about his work. But it tends to, as I say, ignore what's going on in the paintings, and concentrates on the light, which was understood to be Emersonian, to be transcendentalist, to be, in other words, distinctly American, for a generation who wanted to write a history of American culture that was not dependent on European culture.
Mm-hmm. And it has very little to do with what Lane was actually up to, as you're explaining it.
Well, I would say that it had much more to do with what was going on in American culture in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah. And Richard Candy in the questions and answers writes, I agree. This, like all of your work, is a great antidote to some silly interpretations. Thanks for your terrific reinterpretation.
Well, thank you for that nice comment.
Henry Rose, and this ties back to the question of Lane's reputation. Henry Rose asks, how did F.H. Lane become Fitz Hugh Lane, which for many of us was how we encountered him 30 years ago?
Right. Well, his name, that's the chapter called Canvas. It's all about identity. And the naming situation is really peculiar. He was born Nathaniel Rogers Lane. So he was known for his first 27 years by a name that none of us know him by. He was not an artist then. He was a shoemaker. At the age of 27, he changed his name to Fitz Henry Lane. He moved to Boston to become to work in a lithography firm where he was doing sheet music and advertisements and the kinds of things that the first generation of lithographers were doing. And he specifically asked that his name be changed to Fitz Henry Lane. So as I say, there's a chapter on that. So, but that wasn't the question. The question was, why did we know him as Fitz Hugh Lane? And I'd say this oblivion in which his career fell was sufficiently dark and long that even his proper name was lost. And somebody decided, I think a dealer, and I think I've tracked which one, and it was in the second decade of the 20th century, probably thinking about a Fitzhugh chinaware. It's a kind of ceramic pattern imported from China, which was very popular in those days. Thought that the Fitz H must be Fitzhugh, and just christened him that. And the peculiar thing, of course, is that it wasn't sorted out until, gosh, about 15 years ago, when the librarian, the archivist at the Cape Ann Museum decided, well, let's look at the public record, because you have to, when you change your name, it is actually a public act, and the public record made very clear that his name was Fitz Henry. So yeah, so I've kind of muffled it. I just say Fitz H, because that's how he was known to his contemporaries. They called him Fitz. They didn't use that middle name when they spoke about him, generally speaking. And when he signed things, it was Fitz H. So yeah, that's why I kind of muffled that.
And you mentioned that before he turned to the painting, to doing the kinds of paintings that you write about mostly in the book, he was an artisan lithographer, essentially. What difference did that make for his career as a painting, to start out in what was, in a sense, an art that was mechanically reproducible, that was more commercial in a sense?
Well, I guess I wouldn't so much compare his lithography career to his painting career as to compare his lithography career to his career as a shoemaker, which he was assigned to this bench artisanship because he was lame. Something happened when he was a youngster. We think it was polio that meant it was very difficult for him to walk. He used crutches the rest of his life. And his mother, as a widow, was given special tax dispensation when he was a teenager because she was looking after a disabled child. So he was seen by his contemporaries, from this artisanal background. His father was a sailmaker. They were artisans, as not able to be a useful member of society. So, as I say, he was set to work making shoes, but he was drawing. It was clear that he was drawing, and somebody noticed, and somebody said, there's this brand new art form or commercial form called lithography that's just been introduced. It's been imported from France, and it involves drawing on stone and then making prints in multiples. Therefore, it's really good for advertising and sheet music and stuff like that. So he goes to Boston and he gets training in a lithographer shop. So he's still drawing. And a lithograph does include the gesture of the drawings, in spite of the fact that it is a reproductive medium. And I hazard that it was through his lithographs that he got his most important patron, or a patron that was most important in one sense, and that is Robert Bennett Forbes, because he was illustrating Forbes's publications. And this was very important. Forbes was very conscious of his legacy and his position. And these illustrations contributed to making his publications important and read. So I hazard, and I have no documentation for this except that there's no other obvious source, that it was Forbes who put the money forward to enable Lane to go back to Gloucester, buy a piece of property, build himself a home, and become a fine artist. Because there's really no other easy explanation for this meteoric rise from marginal artisan status to someone called Esquire, and living in his own property. His sister and his sister's husband and 8 children lived with him, so he wasn't there all alone. But he was a very different person when he returned in 1848 to Gloucester.
And that house, which you describe at length and show photographs of in the book, is quite astonishing, I think.
It is. And I really was astonished to find out that there are no Historic American Buildings Survey drawings of it, that there are just a few drawings that were done in the 1930s of one of the floors. It's an artwork. Okay, it was produced by, he designed it, he had it built. It's unlike anything else in town. It's unlike anything else on Cape Ann or in Massachusetts for that matter. So it is an original artwork. It belongs now to the city of Gloucester, which uses it as a place to rent to 3 different nonprofits. And they use it for storage and they use it for office space. But the sense of this as an amazing artwork hasn't quite gotten through to the Gloucesterites.
Can you tell us a little bit about it for those of us who are, on the call who haven't been there?
Sure. I guess I should have put a slide of it up. For starters, it's made out of granite in a building tradition that was entirely frame and wood. And it has 7 gables, which immediately sends us to Hawthorne. But as it turns out, he designed and built it before Hawthorne published The House of 7 Gables. It is Gothic, not only in those very steep gables, but also in the interior. It has Gothic details. And nothing else in Gloucester is Gothic. It is a singularity. And in a sense, it's a vernacular house, both in its design and its execution. Obviously, the stonemasons weren't used to building a stone house. And so the stonework is kind of rough and odd, but it's very imposing. And his contemporaries remark on it. Why did he want a stone house? Well, that cost probably 3 times what a frame house of the same size would have cost. But possibly because Gloucester had burnt not once but twice. And I think he was thinking about something that wasn't going to burn easily. But I think he also just wanted to make a statement. I should also say that he built this house not in the polite part of town where the sea captains and the bankers and people like that lived, but in the harbor, right on the edge of the harbor, where he was surrounded by the businesses that keep a global fishery going. So there are all sorts of interesting things about this house. So yeah, that's the chapter called Granite.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. And you mentioned, that you think potentially one of his patrons, helped him make that house happen. Maybe we could talk a little more about those patrons. One of our audience members asked, and I should encourage audience members to put your questions in the Q&A. One of our audience members asks, did Lane have British or other European patrons? I wonder, if you could say a bit about the patrons in the context of the global reach. It's in those global chapters about how he is interested, or he's connected to places like Suriname and California, that we really see his patrons come to the fore.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. No, his patrons were all Gloucester based or Boston based. But they go. They are all people with global horizons, such as Forbes, who was a China trader, or to put it in other terms, he was an opium trader, and very wealthy from that business. So it's a so he's actually painting views that are useful for them in memorializing places that they have been. So there is some question. For instance, he does a view of Puerto Rico for Sidney Mason, who was a terrific patron of his. And there's a question of, did he go to Puerto Rico to do that painting? If he did, it was his only time outside of New England. Well, no, I take it back. We know he also went to Baltimore, but otherwise he's New England based. Yeah, he did. He had no British patrons. The people who commissioned his artworks came to his studio, which, with little notices in the newspaper, talked about his studio is always open. Come by. And they selected topographic drawings and ordered paintings to be made in discussion about what time of day it would be, what kind of vessels would be in the image, what kind of activities. So there was a lot of conversation, face-to-face conversation with with the folks commissioning works from him. And we know about this because there's a portfolio of 110 drawings that his friend Joseph Stevens annotated, with little notations about who ordered paintings made from these topographic views, and also little initials on the side of the people who were present when he was out there drawing. It's clear that he did not go out there drawing by himself. He had a cohort that came with him, including children, maybe picnics, who knows. And so that's how we know about his patrons. That's the principal way we know about his patrons.
Where is that document with the annotations and all the rest?
That's a kind of a vexed question. That's a portfolio of drawings that was in the remainder of his estate, which was bestowed upon Joseph Stevens, who then gave that portfolio to a person of younger generation at the end of the 19th century, who then gave it to yet someone else. Finally, when I guess I should back up and say, Gloucester had no art gallery. It had no art business. There was no place. His paintings hung in the stationery store, and they hung in the bank, and they hung in sort of a men's club. But these drawings were eventually given to the Cape Ann, what's now called the Cape Ann Museum. So there was an institution finally in the early 20th century that was formed that could take such a thing. So they took those, and alas, in the middle of the 20th century, 4 of the drawings were sold, and which is too bad, because otherwise they're all at the Cape Ann Museum, and you can see them all together and study them there.
And you, of course, did a lot of the research for this book here at the American Antiquarian Society. I would love it if you could share with us a little bit about how that research, or even some of the particular sources you used, helped craft your approach to landscape.
Sure, I'm really happy to. I'm a very self-indulgent researcher. I kind of follow my nose, and if it looks interesting, I follow my curiosity. And it occurred to me that if I didn't have, I didn't have a workbook by this artist, I didn't have any list of works or list of I didn't have letters, I didn't have diaries. A couple of diaries mention him, and I found them at the American Antiquarian Society. But I wanted to get a sense of his world and the kind of decisions and thoughts that he and his patrons and the other members of the town had at the time, because I was new to the Antebellum period. I had worked in an earlier period, and I'd worked in a later period, but I hadn't worked in the Antebellum period. So I was really the happiest camper. I just sat down under the dome there and read hard copy those newspapers, the newspapers that were available for Lane to read from his early adulthood through when he dies during the Civil War. So I'm just reading these daily newspapers and learning immensities about not just Lane, but his context, Gloucester and the world, how it fit in the world. And I guess I should add that one of those articles I read was a one-liner. I mean, these newspapers had these like one-line articles, right? This one-liner reported on the publication of a memoir by a member of the Gloucester community. This is a town of 7,700 people, right? Well, this memoir is written by a member of one of the 4 Black families in Gloucester. And of course, being at the American Antiquarian Society, I said to myself, well, let's look at this memoir. And this woman happens to be almost an exact contemporary of Lane's, but she's Black, and she, like him, grew up in a state of poverty, but hers was considerably more impoverished. And she has a really exciting life. And so that's my next book.
Oh, how exciting.
Yeah, I bumped into it by just sort of, and I never would have found it if I'd been reading on microfilm and been going through an index and looking for certain keywords. I guess it's
because going through the newspapers day by day, page by page, brings up so much more. It's completely different from keyword searching and only finding the things that you particularly searched for. We have a question here following up. Which newspapers were of most interest, local or more national publications? Sounds like the local Gloucester papers were the key.
Well, except that, as I quickly learned, that the local Gloucester editors filled their papers with stuff they stole from elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So I was up on national news by reading the Gloucester papers. What the Gloucester editors thought was important that was going on, let's say in terms of Indian removal or in terms of gold. I have to tell you that from the December of 1848 until the outbreak of the Civil War, every single issue of the paper had an article about California gold. It was such an upsetting. I have to talk about why it's upsetting, but anyway, it's such an upsetting thing that these salt of the earth New Englanders who were going to, pass their farm on to their son, who was going to, maybe get a different brand of sheep or something, but was going to, live the honorable New England life. These guys were heading off in packs, being outfitted in Boston with, among other things, Colt revolvers, and heading west in groups and coming back with pocketfuls of gold, which completely upset the patriarchy. I mean, the protests in the papers are something to be seen. And there is a reading of Lane's paintings that said, and I do try this reading, that his paintings are part of the reaction to that, part of saying, don't be a gambler. Stay here, be an honorable, virtuous person and see this economy that works and contribute to it. Yeah.
But Gloucester, the way you describe it, Gloucester is changing under their feet. That, Gloucester is becoming more of a tourist community over time and so on. So is that very economy, and we've got a couple of questions here that I'll go to next, is that very economy changing in ways that make the paintings over time somehow reminiscent of an earlier time?
A really interesting question, because there is a nostalgic note to his work. The attempt for Gloucester to become a tourist mecca is foiled by the fact that it is the fisheries capital. And we have to imagine thousands upon thousands of fish being disembarked and disemboweled daily. And that doesn't compute too well with tourism. So the tourists stayed on the train and went to Rockport. But yeah, the idea is that New Englanders are now going to the beach and going to the mountains and looking and enjoying the landscape for their holidays during this period. As you say, a new way of thinking about how to spend your leisure time.
Yeah. We have a comment here, which we'll be forwarding this to you too. Margaretta, I'm a retired maritime history professor at Maine Maritime Academy in Castine, Maine. Remain active with maritime history, mostly through historic songs of the sea at MMA, University of Maine Machias, and the Pembroke, Maine Historical Society. I say this of myself because your presentation is one of the best I've ever seen in every aspect, and this person has given their email address, which we will send along to you to connect you with the person. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. That's from Stephen Sanfilippo. We have two questions that connect Lane, or ask about connections between Lane and other artists. We have one from Diana Korzanek, who says, Maine hired German artist Francis Greater to draw and create lithographs of Maine geology. Any connection? Had Lane seen Greater's published geological prints? And then another, Chris Daly asks, whether Lane was an influence on Winslow Homer and whether they ever met. So on the one hand, a potential influence on Lane, and the other, was Lane an influence on Homer? Any thoughts about either of those?
Those are both very provocative. Lane never went to art school. He spent 3 years in Boston. The only thing we know for sure that he saw of other artists' work, and there's sort of three categories. One is, we know that he had contact with Robert Salmon, who was an elderly English artist working in Boston during that time. So we know that he had contact, whether it was one day or whether he was cleaning brushes for him and watching what he was doing. We don't know what the quality of that is, but Robert Salmon was a marine painter. And so there was some contact there. Second, we know that Lane saw a traveling exhibition of Dusseldorf paintings that came through Boston. And we know that it impressed him. There's a conversation that goes on in a letter about how he and his pal were both very impressed by the Dusseldorf paintings. But he doesn't paint anything that looks like the Dusseldorf paintings, either in manner or in subject. And lastly, we know that he subscribed to a journal called the Art Journal that was published in London. Happily, Berkeley has the Art Journal here, and it was in the stacks, which shouldn't have been the case for something published in 1836. But anyway, I was able to move all the volumes into my office and go through them, because even though we don't know if he read the newspaper, I was reading the newspaper, but we do know he read the Art Journal. And what he learned in the Art Journal was not so much about German painting or French painting, but about Constable and Turner. If I were going to talk about influences I would say maybe Constable, but I would have to make that case. Constable, who painted his local community as his father's mill, the way the canals worked, the way the locks on the canals worked, that kind of thing. That's very much the same kind of nitty gritty. But Constable was a more ambitious painter, painting things that are 6 feet wide, but of course you wouldn't know that because he was looking at these in reproduction, in engraving reproductions in this journal. So the last question is, when's the Homer? Really interesting question. I would like to say that Winslow Homer had an eye on Lane, had some access to seeing some of Lane, because Homer comes and paints in Gloucester when he's looking for people related to who do the kind of work that is intimate with the natural world, and so he spends time in Gloucester, and yeah, it's very, but of course Homer doesn't show up there until 10-15 years after the death of Lane, so they never would have met in person. I'm quite confident about that. But Homer may have had his eye on something he saw in Gloucester, or something was brought to his attention. Don't know. But I would like to write on that, unless somebody else gets there first.
That would be great. And I'm just going to, the last comment I'm going to quote is from Amy Myers, who says, Margaretta, a magnificent, transformative, and enjoyable talk. Thank you as always and ever. And I think that is a fitting end, because our hour is drawing to a close. Margaretta, thank you so much for this conversation and for your book. And I'll say again, the title of the book is Painting the Inhabited Landscape, Fitz H. Lane and the Global Reach of Antebellum America. All I can say is go buy it, go read it. It's fantastic. And thank you so much, Margaretta.
Thank you, Scott. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, I also want to thank all of you who've been watching us on Zoom tonight. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, our public programs are all available on the AAS YouTube channel, typically a few days after the program. We have a couple of programs coming up in the next few weeks that I'll mention now. Our next public program, which is hybrid, that is in person here at AAS and also live streaming, takes place 1 week from tonight, Thursday next week, when Lawrence Buell will be in Antiquarian Hall to talk with Megan Marshall about his new book, Henry David Thoreau, Thinking Disobediently. That's Thursday, October 12th at 7 p.m. 1 week later, also hybrid, in-person and live streaming, on October 19th, Nell Irvin Painter will be here to deliver the Robert C. Barron Lecture, which will be entitled Sojourner Truth Was a New Yorker, and She Didn't Say That. We have a full slate of programs for the rest of the fall, beyond these ones in the next couple of weeks. So please check the AAS website. For now, thank you, Margaretta. Thanks to all of you who've been watching tonight, and have a wonderful evening.